Welcome to Indiana Newsdesk. I'm Joe Wren. Well, it could be months before we know whether the state Supreme Court will punish Indiana Attorney General Curtis Hill for allegedly groping a state lawmaker and 3 legislative staffers last year at a party. In his testimony, Hill called the charges vicious and false. Hill was defiant this week during his hearing at the State House on professional misconduct charges. Our State House reporter Brandon Smith was at this week's hearing. Brandon, could you walk us through a little bit through this week's testimony? What happened at the State House this week?
Sure. It was 4 days long. It was 26 witnesses, hours of testimony, dozens of pieces of evidence like emails, text messages, documents sent back and forth between Hill and some of his staffers and outside consultants. So much of it was what we had sort of heard already throughout the last year and a half. The 4 women who say Curtis Hill groped them testified on the first day, and then the following couple of days were a lot of people, many people corroborating what they had already testified to. Some people that the defense called to rebut what they had said, or at least said that they didn't see Curtis Hill do anything. Though there was a bombshell, I would say. We heard a new allegation that we hadn't heard at any point in this process before from a former employee of Curtis Hill's in Elkhart.
Before we get to that, though, really quick, how were these hearings different from the Inspector General's report back in October 2018?
Well, for one thing, they were public. The Inspector General's report was entirely done privately. It was an investigation. What this was it utilized some of the witnesses that the Inspector General talked to in her investigation. But what this was a public process, a disciplinary commission complaint that could see Curtis Hill lose his law license. The Inspector General's report was whether he violated any state ethics rules. And then, of course, there was the special prosecutor's decision as part of that to decide whether or not to press criminal charges.
So now you mentioned another woman came forward with allegations of sexual misconduct. Now this is when Hill was the Elkhart County prosecutor. So will this affect the proceedings at all?
It's tough to say. We'll see what the hearing officer, Myra Selby, and then later the Indiana Supreme Court decides to do with Curtis Hill in this case, and what, if any, role this new allegation will play. This new allegation was that Curtis Hill, while the Elkhart County prosecutor, made an explicit sexual advance to this woman who was a subordinate and married at the time, as was Curtis Hill. The disciplinary commission said that this was part of a pattern of conduct that they're trying to establish for Curtis Hill. But again, we won't know what effect it has until a decision is made.
And so I guess that's what we're waiting on now. Is there any timeline on how long that could take, or what's next for Hill right now?
Right. Well, at a minimum, it's at least 2 months before we even hear from Myra Selby, the hearing officer, as to a recommendation for what should happen to Hill. There's some technical things that have to happen before she does that. And then that gets essentially appealed to the Indiana Supreme Court, who makes the final decision. But that could legitimately be May or June of next year, even at the earliest.
Okay, Brandon, thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe.